Righto, class. Thank you for joining me once again for a thrilling episode of I really don't know what this is going to be about so much. I've got an idea. I'm guessing. I'm doing this completely off the cuff, sight unseen. Here's a video somebody said I should respond to by someone called Simon Hill on a channel called The Proof with Simon Hill. So let's see whether what Simon Hill has to say provides us with any proof of anything or otherwise. Let's check it out. See what happens. Off we go.
The two most common mistakes I see with epidemiology in the internet discourse are one, giving it too much weight, and two, not giving it enough.
Right. Well, there's your first mistake, Gil Carvalho, because epidemiology should not hold any weight whatsoever for reasons that should become clear as we get through this video a bit further along. Off you go, though.
And we see these all the time. And interestingly, a lot of times the same person is making both, just on different days. So we see this all the time. People, an inconvenient epidemiological study is dismissed because epidemiology is weak. And then a week later, an epidemiological study that supports the belief is touted because it supports the belief, right? So we want to be very careful. It's a natural human tendency. We all have that bug in us to favor the data we like, but we have to be very careful with that and try to be as consistent.
Wow, those people who have been complaining about my audio quality from time to time on my channel, perhaps you should look around and see the quality being provided by others, for example, here, and then perhaps you won't be quite so hard on me.
As possible with the heuristics. So why don't we just dismiss epidemiology? Because there are questions that you can't ask with randomized controlled trials.
So that doesn't make epidemiology science. It still isn't.
You can't ask if smoking leads to lung cancer over 30 or 40 years with a randomized control trial.
Correct. You can't also do the same thing about any aspect of human nutrition leading to any hard health outcome of any kind over any period of time either, Gil.
You can't randomize people to smoke and then follow them for 30 years. It's just not doable, right? And trans fats, another example that also comes from epidemiology. There are many findings, trans fats and cardiovascular disease, right? That connection. There are many findings and many things that we not take for.
The difference, of course, between the findings with regard to smoking and, for example, lung cancer incidence, Gil, and trans fats and cardiovascular disease incidence, Gil, is that the relative differences in incidence for lung cancer in smoking populations is around about 11,500% per pack year of smoking, which is quite convincing as an associative piece of information, whereas the incidence of cardiovascular disease as that relates to the intake of trans fats, for example, Gil, is anything but convincing. The absolute and relative outcome statistics are very, very weak at best, Gil Carvalho, and as such, that's not a comparison of apples with apples. Neither is it a comparison of anything useful with anything else useful, really. It's mishmash. It's nonsense. It's the kind of smoke and mirrors propaganda and spin doctrine we have come to expect from you, Gil Carvalho, as a highly incompetent pseudoscientist, either that or a propagandist of the highest order. And I suspect it's the latter because of your clear devotion to the theology of veganism, which is a mistake, or indeed is evil incarnate, actually, Gil. Human beings are obligate hypercarnivores, demonstrably, and not vegans. So what's next?
For granted, as causal even, that either started with epidemiology or to this day are largely rooted in epidemiological findings.
Okay, there are no causal findings that can be established with epidemiology. None at all, Gil Carvalho. Epidemiology is an associative pseudoscience. It is not a controlled, disciplined, experimental, interventional science. It cannot inform on cause and effect under any circumstances. It gives us an idea about the strength of association between one factor and another, but it informs us in exactly no manner whatever on cause and effect. You have to stop lying, son, if you want to be taken seriously as a scientist. Okay?
So they're complementary because the general idea on the internet, in certain circles of the internet, is that epidemiology is useless and randomized controlled trials are this perfect experiment framed in gold and,
No, that's a straw man. That's a pathetic straw man, Gil Carvalho. False, completely false. What epidemiology is useless with respect to is informing us on cause and effect. What it is useful in is informing us on the magnitude and potential utility of an association, so long as the epidemiology concerned actually reports the observations made without adjusting them, in other words, fabricating, lying, making things up, and as long as that study clearly caveats itself as a statement on association and not cause and effect. Okay? Randomized control trials are useful in establishing the likelihood of a cause and effect relationship. In a much, much smaller population, a delimited, properly selected, properly randomized population, over probably a much, much shorter period of time, Gil. They have different utilities, and it is clowns like you that seems to get their specific utility mixed up, Gil. And then you project your error onto others. Incredible.
In the Hall of Fame, both of those are misconceptions. The reality is epidemiology is extremely important and useful.
Yes, in talking about associations in some cases. When you have an epidemiological study that shows a very, very weak association or a very, very small incidence difference in subpopulations, that's also very useful. It tells us that you're looking in the wrong place for a meaningful association. For example, every single finding on any aspect of hard health outcome in any population of people over any period of time, as that relates to any aspect of nutrition, what you find is results that are very, very weak, and as such tells us to look somewhere else for experimental or potential experimental work to try to establish some kind of cause and effect over some kind of period in some way. Okay?
But it has blind spots, so that's why we interpret epidemiology in context of the totality of evidence.
Some people do. You, Gil, are not competent to place any scientific work in its context. You are an ideologue, clearly, demonstrably, unequivocally. You have this completely wrong. Every single video I have ever seen that was made by Gil Carvalho is full of inaccuracies, lies, incompetencies, misinformation. It's nonsense from top to bottom, including this video so far.
You don't do a logical leap from an observational study in the vacuum to, okay, there's causal relationship. That's a mistake.
Yes, it is. You cannot do that under any circumstances.
But the same is true about RCTs. They have lots of blind spots.
Yes, there are many RCTs or so-called RCTs that are not well designed, not well disciplined, not well written, not well completed, and those should be interpreted on a case-by-case basis by competent scientists such as myself, Gil Carvalho, and not you, and commented on by such competent individuals. Again, Gil, not you. Okay, what's next?
Caveats. Especially when you get into nutrition, for example, the longer the RCT, the more it looks like an epidemiological study.
Not so at all.
More you have to rely on what people tell you they eat, for example. One of the problems that's...
Or you could do a proper study, Gil, where you lock people in a lab and you keep them under observation. And if you want to do a multi-decadal statement about cause and effect, you'd have to lock them in a lab for multi-decades. And that's never going to happen, is it, son? So we're back to square one. There is no nutrition science to speak of extant, and that's what we should report because we are disciplined scientists. That's what I do report because I am a disciplined, actual, competent scientist. I tell the truth to the public. I don't sugarcoat it. I tell them that the science underpinning just about every assertion made by nutrition scientists in the field of nutrition science is nonsense, is not supported by science for that very reason. I hope this is going up people's flagpoles. What's next?
Pointed out one of the caveats of epidemiology, right? The relying on self-reports, the food frequency questionnaires.
Right. People tell lies about what they've been eating, Gil, and if they're not lying, they often just simply get it wrong. Could you tell me what you had for breakfast last Tuesday? Probably not.
Well, when you're looking at a randomized control trial that goes on for years.
A randomized control trial, the word there that would be inappropriately used in the case where it's not would be control, Gil. In which case, the subjects are locked in laboratories under observation. There is no equivocality about what they have in fact been eating because they have been observed under control. That's what the word control means, Gil. If you haven't done that, you shouldn't call it a randomized control trial because it isn't one. Okay? This isn't difficult to understand.
You have to rely on what people tell you they eat.
Not in a control trial, you don't, because they are controlled.
With some exceptions, historical exceptions where people are trapped in a certain place in mental hospitals or something. There are some examples like that. But in
Right. There you go.
general, most RCTs that are not a month or two long, that are longer, you still
Then they're not randomized control trials. Anytime you've got free living individuals under their own recognizance, that is not a control trial, Gil, and it should not be referred to as such. Simple.
have to tell people what to eat, but then you have to ask them, are you eating what I told you to eat? And you have to rely on their report. Sometimes there are other mechanisms you can measure serum markers and try to correlate, but you can do that with epidemiology as well. The point is just that no experiment is perfect.
Correct. There are no perfect experiments, and in nutrition science, there are no experiments to speak of at all, actually, because experimental work, Gil, is disciplined and adequately controlled and properly observed. Show me a study that's done that, Gil, over any period of time longer than a few days. And we'll have something to talk about in terms of what's the nutrition science tell us, Gil. Until then, stop misrepresenting the state of the science to people, Gil Carvalho.
And these things cover for each other's blind spots, just like a randomized control trial isn't really doable for 20 years, by and large.
It really isn't doable. You won't get ethics for that. You also won't get finance for that. It will never be done. Forget about it.
The epidemiology covers that.
No, it doesn't. The epidemiology covers nothing but a look at an association between self-reported nutrition intakes over a given period of time and some hard health outcome of some kind under no control and no observation to speak of. It's a naturalistic observation. It's nonsense, Gil. It doesn't cover anything. Certainly not cause and effect. Okay?
The RCT, you're typically limited with the sample size. The epidemiology is very good at that. But then the epidemiology has some weaknesses.
Like it's garbage.
And that's where the RCT is strongest. So it's like using, you don't use a hammer exclusively to build a house. You use different tools depending on the exact task.
Yes, but we're not building a house here, Gil Carvalho. We are trying to educate people on what the state of actual nutrition science really is, rather than misleading them and telling them that there is support for ideas that there simply is not support for, Gil Carvalho. And there is no support for veganism. None at all in the science, anywhere. What's next?
At hand. Here's the same thing. You look at all of the evidence, and
all the evidence, Gil, is none regarding human science, human nutrition science. None. It does not exist. That's the point. There is some science that leads us to make some fairly robust conclusions about the likely optimal diet for human beings, but it doesn't come from nutrition science fraternity. It comes from other actual sciences outside of that, like anthropology, for example, nitrogen and carbon isotope testing of the collagen of long bones of human remains throughout our existence on the planet, like comparative anatomy and physiology undertaken by competent comparative anatomists and physiologists. And that doesn't include Milton Mills, by the way, not remotely. I'll cover that another day. It also, involves things like actual competent analysis of human metabolic pathways and systems, human genetic studies, and an understanding of the Darwinian theory of evolution. It's not even a theory, it's a fact. Those are the things, those are the threads that you draw in to look at the totality of evidence, as you call it, Gil, from all of the actual science. None of the science exists within the fraternity of human nutrition science. It's an area of ring-fenced ideology. Okay? It's all bought and paid for. It's all ideological, theological, and it's nonsense. Okay? What's next?
Where these different experimental approaches align.
What do you mean different experimental approaches? There's only one experimental approach, and that is a properly powered, properly randomized, properly delimited, properly tenured, properly observed, properly controlled, interventional experimental trial where all other possible confounds and degrees of freedom to speak of are controlled. Absolutely. Failing that, that is not an experimental approach. Okay?
Where they give you generally an answer in the same direction, that's where our confidence is strongest. That's where we...
That doesn't give us confidence of veracity and correctness. That just tells us that two completely different forms of information gathering or pseudo information gathering happen to align in some way that you would like to view it from. That does not provide us with evidence of anything whatever, Gil Carvalho. What's next?
We start to think it's a fundamental fact of nutrition or public health or whatever it may be.
Right. Well, what a load of absolute gut rot from a complete incompetent pseudoscientist. Gil Carvalho, just absolutely ridiculous from start to finish. Completely failed to put epidemiology into its correct context, which is as a pseudoscientific mishmash of nonsense, frankly. Also completely failed to place the so-called human nutrition science into its correct context, as I've done for you today. You're welcome. There you go. Stick around the channel for more incisive and up-to-date views on the science concerning human nutrition, such that it is. Hope you got something from this. Join me next time. Thanks for the suggestion, whoever that was that sent me this, that said you should look at this. Okay, good. See you then. Ciao for now.